Okay, so Division One. Division One is a little more complicated. As I said, my entire career has been at the Division One level. Again, if you think about certifying student athletes, as you're advising students, if you think about the different components to their overall certification to compete, it makes it a little easier. So again, you'll start with good academic standing, and I didn't put that slide in here, but is the student in good academic standing per your policy? Yes. Okay, now I'm going to move on to the credit hour requirements, and then I'm going to move into percentage of degree and GPA. So again, if you think about it in steps, it makes it a little easier to certify or to advise your students to make sure they're hitting the different wickets that they need to. So this slide is a really good one. There's a lot of our staff members that put this up on their wall because it kind of shows an overview of everything except the GPA piece when you're thinking about Division I student athletes' progress towards degree. So as you can look, from their freshman year all the way through their fifth year, if they need it, you can see the credit hour requirements throughout there. So the freshman year, they need 6 hours each term, different than Division II that needed 9. Division I needs 6 hours each term. Again, 18 and 27 during the academic year. And then for freshmen only, you can see that blue box on the bottom where it says 24 and 36. So in their first year, freshman student athletes must complete the 6 each term, 18 between the 2 terms or 3 quarters, or 27 through the 3 quarters. And then they must also have 24 or 36 prior to that second year. Again, like Division II, any credits the student earned during that time can count towards those credit hour requirements. But ultimately, for Division I student athletes, they're eventually going to have to meet that percentage of degree where you can see that orange box of 40% will be the first mark. So we talked about the freshman year. The sophomore year, again, looking at 6 hours each term, 18 for the year, they don't have the 24 or the 36 again. So ultimately for a Division I student in their second year, if they get 6 per term and 18 or 27 in the 2 terms or 3 quarters, then they meet the credit hour requirements. Now, why did Division I do this? Again, each division has their own philosophy. Division I has percentage of degree, which we'll see there starting in their junior year. And the Division I membership really believes that percentage of degree will catch students that aren't meeting the credit hour requirements. Whereas Division II looks at it as the credit hour requirements, as long as they're degree applicable, once you just determine your degree, is going to get you there at the same point as the percentage of degree. So however you want to look at it, Division I has percentage, whereas Division II looks at the credit hours, and their credit hours are a little bit higher each term than Division I. So after the sophomore year, even though all the credits that the student took in the first 2 years can count for the credit hour requirement, again, thinking of segmenting the requirements, you have to go back and look at those first 2 years and determine, did the student meet 40% of their degree? So again, at the national office, we don't like math very much, so we try to keep it simple. We have found 120 hours is a pretty good average of degree programs across the country. If you think about the first 2 years, while the student may have passed 48 hours in those first 2 years, 24 and 24, that doesn't necessarily mean they met the 40% requirement. So again, the athletic department, their compliance staff are going to go back and look at that certification. But as academic advisors on campus, it's helpful for you to know and maybe have this slide up to remember, hey, I've got a student athlete that I'm advising. They're entering their 3rd year. I need to make sure that they've got at least 48 or whatever that 40% credit hour requirement is to make sure that they stay on track and they're not missing those percentages. And again, as you look through the credit hour requirements, 6 hours each term, 18 and 27, that doesn't change for the rest of their career. It's just the percentage goes up So after the junior year, we're going to go to 60%. After their fourth year, senior year, we'll go to 80%. If they need that fifth year, they must have the 80% mark met. And then you can see there's another exception in the fifth year for those students that are getting close to graduation, that credit hours and percentages, or not percentages, but credit hours required and full-time enrollment a little different in that fifth year if the student's close enough towards graduation. So again, hopefully this slide provides, just a one-shot look at most of the requirements for Division I students, and hopefully it makes sense to everybody. And then we have a question here: what about students who begin a graduate program in their senior or fifth year, and how does that credit hour requirement change? So for our post-bac students, our graduate students, really the requirement comes down to they need 6 credits at that point, and that's the only credit hour requirement that they have. Once they've earned that first degree, again, that's our ultimate goal, is to make sure they get at least 1 degree. But if they have the opportunity to go into a fifth year and work on a graduate degree or a second degree, they must have 6 hours of graduate credit. And again, thinking about the prerequisite piece of that, the 6 hours that a graduate student must earn must be towards a graduate requirement. So again, using business as an example, a lot of times you'll have a student that got a non-business degree, undergraduate degree, and they want to go to get their MBA. But to do that, they may be accepted in the MBA program, but the first semester or 2, they may be taking prerequisites or undergraduate courses to get them up to speed to the business graduate level courses. So those prerequisites, if they're not a part of the MBA program, the 30 or 90 hours, whatever their program may be, again, those would not count towards the 6 that they need to earn. So they would have to find some other graduate level credit to meet that 6. So that's where the change in the credit hour requirements for a graduate student change. If it's the same for they finish their undergraduate degree and they want a second undergraduate degree, just a second degree, not necessarily in the graduate school, the credit hour, the 6 credit hours must be towards that second degree, whatever that may be. So again, depending on the degree program, just as long as those 6 hours go towards that degree, they would meet that 6. Okay, to get down into the weeds just a little bit more, I'll quickly go through the credit hour piece of it since we spent a good number of time on that, but you'll notice there that 4th bullet talks about baseball and football having different requirements. And that's something that you'll see in the Division I, where Division II and III don't necessarily have sport-specific requirements. Division I does, and that's because our membership, typically our coaching associations, determine that, hey, we want specific things for our students because it's going to get them closer to graduation quicker. So we'll talk about that briefly. Again, the credit hours, just another way to look at that other slide, breaks it down a little bit more. 6 hours requirement does not apply during a part-time term. So if you have a student that has a part-time term, they can't compete because they're in a part-time term unless they're in that final term for their degree, which is different than just the 6 hour requirement. They can't compete, so essentially they have no requirements during that term. That term would also not count for their percentage of degree, so it's full-time terms is what we're looking at. The 6 hours, again, must be degree applicable after the 4th full-time term, and then football has the additional standard that we'll talk about here shortly. 18 and the 27 is triggered for full-time enrollment in any part of the regular academic year. So again, similar to Division II, if that student starts the fall full-time, then they're going to be held responsible for the 18 or 27, depending on your semester versus quarters. Summer school cannot be used for this, and many terms after the regular academic year. And I say that because I know a lot of institutions have a J term or a mini term, for lack of better term, between the fall and the spring or between quarters. They have those within the academic year. Those credits can be used for 18, but they cannot be used for the 6 or the football requirement. If it's outside, so after your spring graduation, some institutions have a Maymester or a mini term after the conclusion of that spring term. Those courses could not be used for the 18 or the 27 because it's after the regular academic year. So again, just some twists and turns to think about as you're advising students where those courses fit into academic year or not. And then again, the 24 and 36, this is a first year freshman requirement only, must be completed prior to the second year, and credits can apply to any of the degrees because again, it's in the first 2 years of the program, so the credit hours can be anything to get the 24 and 36. One question we get regularly is, what about remedial courses? In remedial courses, this is essentially, you can use up to 6 hours. They can only be used in the first year, and obviously they're not going to count towards percentage because they're not part of the degree program. But again, you can use 6 hours when you're trying to get to that credit hour requirements. Here is the football and baseball that I talked about. Again, I won't spend a lot of time on this. Football, essentially, instead of 6 in the fall term during their season, they must earn 9 semester or 8 quarter hours. And if they don't, you can see there's some issues that they have in the next season if they don't earn that. But again, the membership has decided football needs to be more focused during those years, so the requirement's a little higher during the fall term. For baseball has determined that those students must be eligible prior to the fall term, or they can't compete in the spring. So they must be eligible prior to the start of the fall. They can't get well, as you can see there in quotes, like other sports, like track. They're not eligible going into the fall term. They could spend the fall term getting eligible for their spring season. Baseball has decided those students need to be eligible prior to the fall, or they haven't earned the right to compete during the spring. And again, there are waivers and exceptions for that. Percentage of degree, again, we've talked about this already. Another slide that you could print and put up, but it just talks about, you can see on the arrow there, entering first-year student athlete. In the first 2 years, they're really working on getting that 40%. And then as the arrow there says the 5th semester, they need to have completed by 40% of their degree. And you can see the different percentages as you go over to the star to where they graduate and finish, hopefully no later than their 5th year. This slide is just essentially the point here is to show how you calculate the percentage of degree. It's the hours earned over the hours required. A key point to remember is the hours required does not change. It's whatever your catalog says. If it's a 120-hour degree program, that bottom number is always going to be 120 degrees or 120 hours for that degree, unless the department changes the requirement and it's posted in the catalog. So that's essentially what this is talking about. This is an example of if a student had a 122-hour degree program, they earned 73. That's 59.8%. Mathematically, that is never going to be 60%. I know in our society we like to round up, but for NCAA purposes, we do not round up for percentage of degree. It stays at 59.8%, and they're going to have to find at least 1 credit hour in their degree program to get that over the 60% mark. And just the last slide, looking at degree applicability again. Another way to look at it on the left side, as degree applicable hours go up, the more hours the student takes for their 120-hour degree program, the fewer hours remaining for that student. So again, it's just another mathematically way to kind of check your math. If you say they have 73 hours earned in their degree, just make sure the hours remaining total up to the hours remaining and the hours they've earned total to 120 hours in that degree program. Again, I won't go into this, but the key here, degree applicability and the buckets, however your degree programs are broken apart there. When a course is used for certification, it cannot be taken out of the bucket. So once it's in the bucket, it's used and you can't take it back out. So that's why, a lot of times we've talked to a lot of campus advisors, not necessarily athletic advisors, but campus advisors that say, well, in one term, a student may have taken a class that already meets one of the major requirements, but there's another course they could have taken, and they decide to take it in the spring term. So we're just going to swap that and put it into the degree program, into the major spot. For NCAA certification, you can't do that. Once the credit has been counted for certification, you can't change it at that point. So that's essentially what this slide is saying. And if you look in the legislation, there's nowhere in our legislation that we talk about buckets. That's just our easiest way of kind of thinking about it. Once it goes in the bucket, it stays in the bucket. And then finally, the GPA. Again, I won't spend a lot of time on this. It's fairly self-explanatory. The key to think about here is the cumulative GPA required for graduation. We know on campuses there's a variety of different GPAs required for graduation depending on the degree. So the NCAA has said, what is the minimum? What is the lowest GPA you can graduate with at your institution in any one of your degrees? Typically, that's a 2.0. So you take that 2.0, and then you can calculate the percentages down there. After or starting in the second year, they must have 90% of that minimum, which would be a 1.8 for a 2.0 minimum, or a 1.9 for the 95%, and then 2.0 going into their third year. So, fourth year. So that's the GPA requirements. They may still be on academic probation, again, because they're below 2.0, but you kind of go back to that good academic standing and determine if they can still participate at that point. But our GPA requirements are a little different than Division II and III in the Division I realm.